Hey guys, my good friend Joshua Cutchin is stopping in tonight for a lively discussion about death, aliens, and the paranormal. See you in about 5 minutes. Grab your popcorn and snacks. Find a comfy spot, take a seat or lie down, and let me transport you to a place of fantasy, ghost stories, ancient legends, odd creatures, alien encounters, and other magical topics. You may even decide to join the conversation. From faraway lands to your own backyard, with a small dash of pixie dust. Turn out the lights and open your minds. The journey is about to begin. Hey everybody, how's it going? Happy Tuesday. Let me get my little buttons pushed here. Okay. Good evening. I hope everybody's had a great day. The weather here in Northern California was kind of settled down today. I know people heard rain like thunder early this morning. My problem is my house is so well insulated, and it's always been that way, where unless the stuff's like totally on top of me, I don't hear it. So everybody was like posting on Facebook about being awakened by it all. Not me. Didn't hear a darn thing. So I guess I missed out because I like thunderstorms and lightning storms. Anyway, my name is Charlotte. I'm going to be your host for the next hour. I'm also the owner of the California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team based out of lovely Sacramento, California. We are 45 strong up and down the state, which means if you have a paranormal issue or you think you do, we can get to you. It's not a problem, except, depending where you're at, it might take us an hour or two because California is a huge state and we've got mountains and the whole shebang. So, yeah, it might take us a while. I want to welcome everybody tonight. We got a great show planned. And if you're watching from Facebook and you're watching and you enjoy the show, please be sure to hit that like button and you can join me. If you're watching from the events page, join the events page. If you're watching from my regular page, join my regular page. Follow me, right? Follow me. If you're watching from YouTube, I got it right off the bat. There's that little ghost in the bottom right-hand corner right there, right in front of you. And if you like what you hear and you haven't done so already, please hit that and that'll take you to the subscription button. Because we have more than 480 videos sitting over there that you can subscribe to. Different topics. I don't like to cover the same topics every night, so it varies. So if you peruse all those videos for the last 2 or 3 years, you'll see that there's different topics, kind of cool topics. Okay, all right. That being said, Adobe just did a big update to Photoshop and Premiere and everything, and you guys know from this that I'm wearing my glasses, which I don't see as well through. And it's funny because I'm noticing weird things, and I keep thinking it's my computer. I'm forever yelling this last kind of 2 or 3 days, yelling at the computer when I'm working on graphics and stuff. Because Adobe did these. I'm not a person that reads manuals. I don't like reading technical manuals. When I used to build car models when I was a kid, I never read the instructions. I always just went to the photos. Just like now when I build furniture, like from IKEA, I just look at the pictures, right? But anyway, I'm noticing really cool things, but weird, quirky things like at the end when I always do show the guest websites and stuff. This one I always make the upper one at 72 point, and then I have to do the next ones on a separate thing, and I have to lower it manually to lower the size to fit. And somehow with Adobe with the new updates, you can just click a certain way and it sizes it to fit the space right away. Don't know how. So it's stuff like that, and I keep thinking I'm losing my mind. So I'm gonna have to pay better attention because if I have to go in and do it like for reals, it ain't gonna happen. I don't know what the heck I did. Anyway, welcome. If you haven't already, there is a California Haunts Discord. Look us up, or California Haunts. It should be under California Haunts Radio, and what I call you guys is my ghostly groupies. Yeah, my ghostly groupies. But it's fun. It's a fun place. We can go over there. It's like Twitter. You can see pretty much what you want, right? I'm the moderator, so anything goes. Tonight, our old friend Joshua Cutchin's here, and we're going to be talking about. He's got a couple of real neat books out on death and the paranormal. So we're going to be talking about that, and we might just throw in some talk about aliens today. Okay, so I think it's going to be a full night of radio for us. I'm real excited to have him back on, and it's always fun when he comes on. Always fun. That's why I say he's an old friend. So let me get him in, and we will get going here, okay? All right. I see him. He's peeking in. There he is. He's waving at me. Okay, let's get him out of the green room. For God's sakes, get the man out of the green room.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much.
Obviously, having you on puts me in a good mood, so here we are.
Yeah, I know. You're so full of energy. That is in short supply for me nowadays. I have 2 twins who are about to turn 4 years old, so I'm gonna feed off of your energy right now.
I got you.
Okay.
So tell me what's been going on, and since for the people that don't know you, tell me about you.
Oh wow! Well, when was the last time we spoke?
It's been
I
a while.
am. Yeah, it's been a little while. I'm an author and a musician, and my first book was in 2015, and since then I've released, depending on how you count, 5 or 7 books. Two of those are 2-volume series, so that's why I kind of leave some wiggle room. Um, but 7 books since then. I think probably we talked around the last time. When Where the Footprints End was out, which was my
Yes.
Bigfoot
Yes.
2-parter. Yeah, so
Yes.
I've been keeping pretty busy with all that. I've been involved in a UFO, well, actually, technically a ufology tarot project. Not a UFO tarot project, but specifically on like the researchers and stuff in the field, and basically it's sort of applying those figures like Jacques Vallée and Stanton
Mhm.
Friedman and to the major arcana. So that's been keeping me kind of busy. But in the meantime, I somehow found time to write the longest thing that I've ever written, which is the 2-parter called Ecology of Souls: A New Mythology of Death and the Paranormal.
There you go. See, I'm on it.
That's it. Yep.
That's it. I'm on it. So
Yeah.
tell me how or what got you to start doing research on this.
Well, when I take a look back at this, I see that it was sort of popping up in my life earlier than I thought it would be. So what I mean by that is a lot of this I didn't have to piece together because I've been thinking about it in the background probably for about 4 or 5 years at this point.
Mhm.
Um, uh, f- Something that had always really intrigued me the first time I heard it, which I could never get out of my head, was during the aftermath, so to speak, of Whitley Strieber's Communion, which was released in 1987. A real touchstone in UFO alien abduction literature.
Mhm.
Whitley Strieber began getting a ton of correspondence from other experiencers, and he put his wife Anne in charge of reading a lot of this and sort of looking for patterns and collating a lot of stuff. And he remembered distinctly one day going into their study and seeing that she had gone through all these letters and she had made some observations. And one of those, the one that stuck with him, and the one that with me, was this has something to do with what we call death. And that's just such a foreign concept to the way that we typically think of alien abductions nowadays that I
Mhm.
just couldn't get out of my head. But once you have that in your head, you start seeing these little things here and there. There are a lot of cases of people who claim to see dead loved ones in alien abductions. Yeah, obviously, some people might want to say these are screen memories, but at the same time, some of them do appear to be a little bit more genuine and basically seem to resemble what we would call ghosts.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, just
Oh, well, the other thing that really always sort of bugged me was, anybody who's familiar with my work knows that I'm a big fan of comparisons between fairy folklore, especially of Western Europe, but worldwide, generally speaking, and the UFO alien abduction experience. And if you look at those two things long, start to say, I don't know which interpretation is true, but these definitely seem to be describing phenomena that are at least similar, if not the same thing. And this, of course, was largely attributed to Jacques Vallée's 1969 groundbreaking work, Passport to Magonia, where he said, "Hey, look, this UFO stuff looks a lot like this fairy stuff." And it occurred to me after looking into the fairy stuff that a lot of these cultures associated the Fey folk with the dead. I mean, you'd have, people would maybe become fairies after death, or the number of stories where people are prevented from eating or drinking in fairyland by someone who had just died, or else you'll stay there forever. Like, people see the dead in fairyland, and there's some indication that the fairies might actually take you after you die and things like that. That it made me say, well, if you use the transitive property then, and the UFO thing resembles the fairy thing, and the fairy thing resembles the dead, because it's the way a lot of these cultures used to think of them before the rise of theosophy, and we started talking about nature elementals and all that sort of thing, then there does seem to be a real chain of custody between that idea of the dead to the fairies to the UFO stuff. So from there, it just really exploded. And I said, okay, I'm just going to focus on the UFO stuff. But as I got into it, it became very apparent that there are a lot of ways that we used to think about the soul, the human soul, that we've since lost to time. And rather than write about the UFO stuff and have these constant digressions back to, back and forth between these older ideas, I said, well, let's just write a book about these older ideas. And then really volume 2 is more or less the UFO book. And there's cryptids in there as well. But what I kept finding was that there's this thread of death, more accurately, the thread of the cycle of life and death that runs through all of the paranormal in ways that really surprised me, and that I could just, once you start seeing it, for me at least, you can't unsee it. And that's my elevator pitch. Now that I'm done.
Well, I've always had, just within the last 2 years, a theory about aliens myself. In that, after reading and people have heard me say this before, after reading the abduction in the Mojave and what they described the aliens is doing when, for the return trips, made me wonder what exactly it is that we're hunting, paranormal wise. Because they talk about how they can come through walls, how the temperature will drop, and I mean, that's classic ghost.
Well, and they show up on EVPs.
Mhm.
And of course, you can't believe everything that an entity tells you on an EVP, but
Right.
if they are to be believed, they show up on EVPs. They also show up in channeling, and if you look back at the earliest roots of UFOs, like pre 1947 Kenneth Arnold flying saucer, right? If you look really back in like the early stuff, although in the mid 20th century as well, but if we look really back into the early stuff, a lot of the early contactees were theosophists and spiritualists, and they were always bringing these ideas of reincarnation and death in there. I think Kenneth Arnold himself, though I mentioned that, who was sort of responsible for the media sensation that coined the phrase flying saucer, he eventually came to believe several very unorthodox things about the flying saucers. And one of the things that he believed was that they did indeed have something to do with death, perhaps literally being really far out idea for some people, but the ships that transport us to the afterlife. And there's some reasons to entertain that, not necessarily say it's true, but to entertain that and to look at it in a different way that I find really interesting too.
Well, the other thing I was going to say when you mentioned EVPs was that would explain a lot of the EVPs that we get, because they're so a lot of them are so not the frequencies so much, but they're so far off. Or if you get the ones that sound mechanical,
Yeah.
it's like they're coming from another dimension, literally.
Yeah, it does seem that way. And I guess part of what I'd like to emphasize is that, like, when I first wrote Ecology of Souls, I said I'm not going to redefine ghosts. I'm not going to redefine the afterlife. Like, let's just set that to the side. The afterlife might be another dimension. It might be any number of things. Let's just try to establish that there's some sort of connection there. And I think that looking at it from that sort of, I think that some of the ideas that I talk about are really sympathetic to what a lot of people would call, an ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, the idea that these things are coming from a different dimension. And you're absolutely right. Some of these voices that come back say things and sound in ways that don't seem very human at all. And if you look back at the history of EVP, it's kind of debatable who quote unquote discovered it. But some of the earliest people who were playing with EVP were also claiming to pick up, intergalactic transmissions and things like that. I mean, honestly, you could go back to Tesla and Edison, because they were sort of locked in a race to generate, some sort of communication means with the dead. And there are all these sort of connections between Tesla and possible transmissions from outer space as well. So it's a challenging topic to tackle, right? Because you're taking these two, like, sort of almost sacred ideas. I mean, obviously death and the afterlife is literally sacred to a lot of us, but the idea that UFOs are extraterrestrials is in its own way sacred to a lot of people as well. And you're sort of mashing them together. Luckily people have been really receptive to it. So I guess I'm thankful in that way.
So so a few minutes ago, you mentioned the connections and stuff. What are, without giving the whole books away, what are some of the connections that you're seeing?
Well, so one idea that struck me early on was, could these beings be, as I alluded to earlier, sort of in charge of helping us with that transition? And if you take a look at these sort of figures that we see throughout mythology and folklore that are called psychopomps, there seem to be a lot of similarities that you begin to notice. Not the least of which, these psychopomps, you probably recognize some of them, listeners would. Anubis from Egypt, Hermes from the Greek pantheon, even the Grim Reaper, is sort of a folk psychopomp character. And you start to find a lot of similarities between the ways that they act and the things that they carry. I mean, a lot of these psychopomps have, wands or staves. And, how many examples do we have in the abduction literature of the beings holding similar things? To say nothing of, fairies having wands and staves. But these psychopomps could also be natural phenomena. Not oftentimes aerial phenomena. The sun was something that was reborn every day, and sometimes in some beliefs would carry the souls to the underworld, but also animals. And as it just so happens, some of the most common psychopomp animals are some of the most common animals that we see in connection with the UFO phenomenon. The example that I love to use is the owl, which had a lot of ideas of being sort of a messenger between worlds and sort of in some cultures literally taking or guiding people across the veil into the afterlife. And that's been extensively chronicled in the literature and the work of my friend Mike Clellan. So that's one thing that I found really compelling early on. The other thing that I think really sort of allowed me personally to sort of grasp the concept was the other psychopomp symbol that you see a lot of is means of transportation as a metaphor for going to the afterlife. And we're all familiar with, Karen's ferry crossing the river Styx. But also you see this sort of idea of the afterlife being someplace that has to be traveled to. It's, it lies beyond the horizon, it lies beyond a mountain range. And a ship is oftentimes the symbol across a lot of different cultures. I mean, the Norse had their Viking burials, in ships. People would be interred in ships. And ancient China, ships would also be used as coffins. In fact, some of our earliest coffins were actually repurposed ships. So the ship has always been a symbol of transportation into the afterlife. And then you take that idea and you look at the UFO phenomenon, and it's this transportation obsessed question. Like, that's all the questions that we ask about it, right? Like, where do they come from? Where are they going? Where are they going to take me? How do they get here? And I wonder, and this might be a little bit too philosophical, I guess, for some people, but I wonder what happens when a global culture maps every continent and knows that the afterlife doesn't lie beyond that mountain range. It doesn't lie across the horizon at the sea. It doesn't lie under the earth as we once thought. What happens to that need for the afterlife? Like, where do we put that? And I would argue that we put it, in the stars. I mean, the stars have always had connotations with the afterlife in general. So it literally is, the UFO is a vessel of transportation that comes from the other world and comes here and leaves here with people sometimes, apparently. So it seems to map onto that older idea of the psychopompic boat in a lot of really neat and tidy ways.
Well, this would mean, I mean, if this is what's happening and that's what happens to us after we pass, does this mean that we're all hybrids already and we don't realize it?
Well, yeah. So my editor, Barbara Fisher, who is a fantastic human being, she runs the 6 Degrees of John Keel podcast. Barbara took me aside. I mean, I guess as you can do over Zoom, but at one point she's like, Josh, that it's not really all about death, right? It's about death and rebirth. And I said, yeah, it is. But, death is sort of the gateway drug for that. But tied into that question, I think, is that idea of reincarnation. And I think that speaks very much to what you're getting at as well. I suspect, and I have no way to prove this, but that there's just a pool of energy on the other side that gets scooped up and dropped back out. And just in the same way that the rain falling in California, as you alluded to, that rain may have, each raindrop may have molecules in it that once, fell in India or once fell in, I don't know, Oregon and, all over the world. It's comprised of a lot of different stuff. And sometimes I think that maybe we're comprised of a lot of different things, which may very well be every living thing in the universe on the other side. We just sort of get scooped up and reassigned. What I like about that idea is that for me, it handily answers a couple of questions which people seem to pose when they want to sort of tear down these subjects. So, you'll get people who say, well, how can there be, 15 people who say that they're the reincarnation of Napoleon Bonaparte? Shouldn't there just be one? And it's like, well, no, maybe each of them have a piece of Napoleon or something like that. And then, you have some of this literature that's long been regarded as a little bit far out, even amongst alien abduction researchers, of people who claim that a part of them is, a gray alien or something. They have a dual soul. And I think it's another way of looking at it. Another way that sort of speaks to that hybridization theme that you're referring to is these older ideas that I had to dig into really sort of shed some light on that for me. And there's this idea that you'll find this in ancient Norse cosmology, Egyptian cosmology, First Nations cosmology in the in North America and in South America to a degree. This idea that we had multiple souls. It's called researchers refer to it as polypsychism nowadays, the idea that you have a lot of different souls inside of you. But it's this idea that there are these different conflicting pieces and that you're not just this one body, one soul, idea. And I think that maybe something like that is sort of at play as well, and that allows some very oppositional forces to reside within us that sort of look a lot like hybrids.
It's a fascinating topic. And when you started to do the research on this, how difficult was it, or was it difficult?
Well, as I said, I'd been thinking about it for a while, so I had some ideas of where I needed to go. But it ended up being pretty difficult, I'll be honest. In some ways, not to build myself up too much, but in some ways it did feel like I was guided because it went by incredibly quickly. I think I had a full first draft in about 9 months, with about 6 months of research before that. So, and it's a book. I have an endnote problem, so it's got like 4,500 endnotes. There's actually anyone who ends up picking up will know that there are endnotes, but there's no bibliography or actual references at the end of the book. And that's because it turned out being so big that not only did I need to split it into 2 books, but there's actually a third companion book that is just the reference material. So it's 3 appendices, endnotes, and the bibliography. That's available in print, or it's available free from my website, because if you buy the book, you should be able to see where the endnotes are. So, but it was just a function of physical size. The ebook, obviously, that's not a problem. So it was challenging, and part of the challenge was that you end up casting such a broad net that you end up looking at things that seem like they have nothing to do with these phenomena. But as the late French researcher of UFOs, Ami Michel, once said, and I think this is such a true statement. He said, UFOs are the only subject where you start out looking at things in the sky and you end up reading about Arab mystics. You know what I mean? It's definitely like you end up sort of with this voracious appetite for all sorts of things, and you see how we folded a lot of these ideas into this modern mythology. And I don't use the term mythology disparagingly. I think there's an objective reality to this stuff, but it does have a sort of mythological framework that's built up around it.
Right. And when you're talking about, because earlier you mentioned like different Greek gods and some of the fairies, do you think? I mean, it's obvious that ancient people, if they saw the aliens, wouldn't know what to make of them anyway, so they would make them into different gods and stuff, right? I mean, to make them into their own image so that it wasn't so scary and whatnot.
Yeah, so I'm a bit of an iconoclast when it comes to this, and because I just sometimes like being a contrarian, right? So I like to say that no, they had it right, and we've gotten it backwards. Like we're seeing these ancient gods and going, oh, they must have seen space people that they assigned to gods. And it's like, no, maybe there was something that was a little bit more like these sort of divine presences. And that there was literally a Poseidon, or there was literally a Ra, or there was literally a Thor. But to say that there were certain powers that to our eyes today, I suspect, again, this is just my own personal preference, but certain powers that would look a lot more paranormal or supernatural than like flesh and blood aliens. Although the ancient astronaut hypothesis certainly remains on the table. There's a lot of compelling evidence for that.
And how do we know that there weren't people already here, as we started to evolve, that were controlling stuff already, from other planets? We don't know that.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm definitely a big fan of the idea that a lot of what we think we know about the ancient past is conjecture at best, and I think that I think that at the very least, human civilization has risen and fallen more times than we actually know. And that there might have even been a global civilization, prior to our modern world. But also that, there might have been forces that have come from elsewhere. I think that one of the, big things about, I don't know if you remember the Oumuamua interstellar object that came through, but one of the big takeaways from that for me was that it sort of proved, I mean, I don't use that word lightly, it proved that the idea of something like panspermia is definitely feasible, that an object could travel into our solar system from outside the solar system and impact on Earth, and bring any number of things with it, from simple life to more advanced complex life perhaps.
Now, I've interviewed people who have talked about seeing their dead loved ones on these ships when they, go aboard. Are they?
Yeah.
I mean, some I've heard say that they think it's like a hologram, to calm them down. Some people swear up and down it was their dead relatives. What's your take on that? I mean, do you think that it's a real thing, or is it something to calm people down?
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. I love it when I hear people say, "No, this is a thing that happens," because I don't feel like the alien abduction researchers, the people who are just terrestrial hypothesis, are really even willing to admit that as much. So it always
Mhm.
sort of makes me smile when I hear people confirm that. Um, I think it could be. I hate to be a fence sitter, but I think it could be one of two things. I mean, people ask me about what I think UFOs are, and I always say it's probably a combination of a lot of things. I think that
Mhm.
probably the UFOs themselves are 80% misidentifications, and that remaining 20% is everything from psi phenomena to misunderstood weather, meteorological phenomena, to unorthodox terrestrial aircraft, to aliens. Like, I think it's probably a combination of that extra 20%. And I think
Mhm.
that something similar might be going on here. It's not just a one or either or sort of answer.
Mhm.
Because even if you take a stance that these are more metaphysical interactions than actual physical interactions, there's still loads of examples from ancient texts the world over and folklore that a lot of these entities can shapeshift. And oftentimes, especially in the
Right.
fairy literature, if you look at the fairy stuff, like, it's very common for the fairies to take on the shape of a friend or a loved one and sort of lure children or something, to come with them. So I think sometimes it's deception, and I think that sometimes it probably is just what it seems to be. I do suspect that. I mean, there's no way to. The problem is there's no way, even in something that's as unfalsifiable as the UFO question.
Right.
There's no way to
Right.
tell.
Yeah,
You know.
there's no way to tell any of this. Because
Yeah.
my other thought was, while you were saying that too, is our bodies are pretty much a shell. I mean, we know that the soul goes wherever the soul goes after we pass. So maybe that's the deal: is that once our soul goes, it goes back to whatever the main host was.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm very sympathetic to that. Let's put it that way.
Mhm.
That there's something, it always sort of blows my mind when you talk to people who just think that we're squishy robots. I I never got on board with that, but I think that there is some sort of connection, that, and there is a strongly implied sense that we're part of a greater whole. I think there's a
Mhm.
reason that so many spiritual metaphors talk about rivers flowing to the sea, everything sort of rejoining together, and I think host is a good way to put that.
Well, and I was just thinking too a second ago. You got me thinking about all this stuff now. Um, like the out of body experiences that people have, like when they're in the hospital, and they get out of their body and they're staring back at the body that they had. Maybe at that point of death, you end up going to that other dimension that you that you came from.
Yeah, and I would sort of add to that to sort of fold that back into the UFO thing, like,
Mhm.
the number of alien abductions, and it's not, again, we're not going to say all or none, but like the number of alien abductions that resemble out of body experiences is staggering.
Yes.
I lifted up. I mean, some people literally feel like their abduction is taking place on some sort of astral level. They're actually able to see their body left behind, but they've been conditioned by so much pop culture to think that it's like a tractor beam pulling their body up. But like sometimes, no, that's me back there, and here I am somehow levitating. Now, of course, there's a monkey wrench thrown in there, a couple of different reasons. The first of which I still have not found a good solution for, is whenever cars are moved in alien abductions. There's actually a lot of cases where people's cars are physically moved. Now, do cars have souls? I can make an argument for that, but it's not an especially one. So that's one sort of difficulty you have to overcome if you say that alien abductions are unfolding on the astral level. The other sort of problem is that people will say, well, if it's unfolding on the astral level, why do people come back with marks and disfigurements and scoop marks and stuff like that? That's a little bit easier for me, because if you look at things like stigmata, where people sort of take on the personification of Christ in their lives, and they end up with nail wounds in their palms and bleeding from the scalp like the crown of thorns. It seems to be roughly analogous to that. People have received physical wounds from dreams. So Jenny Randall's documented some of that in some of her work. But also there was this idea. I mean, if you look at a lot of the werewolf literature from the medieval era in Western Europe, you'll find that there were some physical transformations, but often as not, it was this idea that the magical practitioner's soul would leave, and either their soul would be as a wolf, because sometimes these multiple souls that we talked about would have an animal form, or that their soul would actually inhabit a wolf. But the thing is that wounds inflicted upon the wolf, even though the sleeper was still in their bed, right? Wounds inflicted upon the wolf that they had sort of, for lack of a better term, possessed, would be mirrored on their physical body as well. So that seems like maybe it's a workaround if these alien abductions are astral, that, well, if something is inflicted upon the soul, it's sort of reflected on the physical form as well.
Absolutely. And doing, and going through your research, what stood out to you the most?
Meaning, what surprised me the most, or what was the thing that kept coming up? What surprised me the most? I have not really gotten a chance in any of my work to talk about lake monsters, and I've always had a soft spot for lake monsters. And there's this great book by Michel Mergier called Lake Monster Traditions. Back when I wrote Where the Footprints End with Tim Renner, some people were like, oh, it's Passport to Magonia for Bigfoot. And I was like, oh, that's great. That's awesome. I love that. That's awesome, because I love Jacques Vallée. I love Passport to Magonia. That makes me feel real good. I'm going to do a Passport to Magonia for lake monsters. And then I picked up Michel Mergier's Lake Monster Traditions, and I'm like, oh, no, it's already been done. And that book is looking at a lot of the ways that sort of the deeper symbolic aspects of lake monsters. And something that really stuck with me, probably honestly my favorite thing that I learned from the book, was lake monsters can be viewed as a death symbol as well. And this requires a little bit of explanation, but a lot of these lake monsters are connected to logs. What I mean by that is to say that a lot of modern skeptics will say that lake monsters are logs. There's this common idea that decaying logs on the bottom of the lake will pop up, and that'll look like, a monster coming up.
Right.
But also, even before that, in a lot of these indigenous tales, you'll find that these lake monsters could sometimes transform into logs. They can sort of become logs at will. And Michel Mergier points out that the log is very closely related to the coffin. And the way that he sort of makes this connection is he says, well, logs were our first boats. Like the earliest person ever wanted to travel across a river probably sat on a log and paddled over. But even more explicitly, our dugout canoes were a log that you'd take and you'd char it out and you'd sort of dig the canoe out. So logs carry with them these funereal associations, these coffin associations, and so do trees in general. Carl Jung once referred to the tree as sort of being Totenbaum, the sort of death tree, the idea that it is explicitly a death symbol. So that really stuck out to me, because you look at something like lake monsters, and you're like, what does this have to do with death? But then you start peeling back that onion, and it just keeps yielding more and more results. And where I wound up with lake monsters, I'm not going to say where I wound up with lake monsters, not because I'm being coy and I'm like, buy the book, but it's a little bit it's a little bit insider baseball and going deeper into the weeds than we
Sure.
probably should. But where I
Okay.
wound up with lake monsters really ended up blowing my mind. So I think the lake monster thing is what just absolutely just floored me. And the other interesting thing about lake monsters that people don't really always appreciate, I have a lot of gripes with cryptozoologists. Let's just put it that way. I'm not invited to cryptozoology conferences. Is that as much as people want to think that lake monsters are some sort of physical creature, there's so much high strangeness around lake monster reports. I mean, it's insane. Loch Ness is also a sort of minor UFO hotspot. There are men in black that pop up around Loch Ness. Famously, Aleister Crowley, one of the most famous magicians of all time, had a house at had a residence at Boleskine House on the shores of Loch Ness, and it's like, okay, was he just really into dinosaurs? Like, why would you do that unless you would be drawn for some specific reason? Not that I'm a Crowley fan at all, but like I think that he probably had a good sense of where the strangeness was. So there are rumors of ancient monuments on the floor of Loch Ness as well. It's surprising the number of oddities, and you can sort of find that in a lot of other lake monster examples. In Lake Mills, Wisconsin, in I believe it's called Lake Astlin, they have a lake monster legend, and they also just so happen to have little pyramidal structures on the bottom of the lake that nobody really knows where they came from. So it's just, lake monsters are weirder than I think a lot of people appreciate. It's not just a big dinosaur, if it's even a dinosaur. Yeah.
Now, the second part of that question that I had, what kept cropping up that stood out to you?
What kept cropping up that stood out to me? So there's this phrase that I ended up repeating throughout the book, and in some ways it's sort of the thesis of the book, which is this idea of dying to death. And what I mean by that is, if you look at a lot of the research that's been done into things like alien abductions, there's a great study pioneered by Ray Hernandez called the FREE study. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but they found that a lot of people who had experienced contact with non-human intelligences sort of shed their fear of death in a big way. I think it's some staggering amount, something like 2/3 of all respondents, and it was a huge study. And I may have those numbers quite wrong, but the idea is it's a significant amount, right? And if you take that idea of sort of being unafraid of death after these experiences, you see that across all these things. I mean, it's obviously something that people come back from near-death experiences with. But then you look at things like psychoactive substances, which I think that altered states of consciousness have a certain role to play in explaining these phenomena. People are using things like psilocybin for terminal end-of-life care, because what happens is people take it and a lot of their anxiety about their impending death just sort of falls away. And then you look at things like these ancient mystery schools, like Eleusis, where people would go on some sort of, for lack of a better term, pilgrimage, and they'd come back and they'd be changed. And a lot of the sort of, we don't quite know what happened at places like Eleusis. We do think that there was some sort of subterranean element, and maybe there were some psychoactive substances used. But what you find in all the literature that emerged from around Eleusis, and just when describing why people went there in the first place, you'll find that there are allusions to, again, no longer fearing death, dying to death. And the idea, I think, is, it's something that you see across a lot of different spiritualities, is that if you can sort of shed that fear of losing your mortal self, you're actually freed, paradoxically, you're freed not only to live the life that you've been given and to make the most of it, but a lot of pressure is taken off, and you can actually sort of set your sights to loftier ambitions, especially in terms of your spiritual development, in terms of helping other people.
Absolutely. How long did it take you to write the first book?
I began researching in October of 2020 and started writing in March of 2021. Completed writing in January of 2022, and then it was edited after that. So yeah, it was about 9 months and about 6 months of research beforehand. And honestly, I really don't know how I did it. I mean, I just don't know how I did it. It's about 265,000 words, which, if memory serves, is probably a third the length of the Bible. And like, I'm not I'm kind of proud of that, right? Like that's an accomplishment, but I'm also kind of not proud of that, because I do think that, like, as Shakespeare said, brevity is the soul of wit, and obviously I have a problem with not being brief, but the topic just kept giving to me and giving to me, and that's why it became like, it's not about UFOs and death, it's about like the whole of the paranormal. I ended up talking about near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences. Obviously, these altered states of consciousness. I mean, the number of these psychoactive substances that have some sort of link to death in their mythology is staggering. Like, people talk about ayahuasca a lot. Ayahuasca means vine of the dead or vine of souls. Like, the idea is that it puts you in that sort of space. Talk about the old fairy traditions, but also things like these ancient monuments, like the stone circles and the burial mounds that we see both in Western Europe and in the United States. A lot of these sites were burial sites. They were sepulchral sites. Even if they didn't start out that way, they'd be places where people would end up burying their dead afterward. And then talking about things like ley lines. Like, what do ley lines have to do with all this? Well, if you look at some of these straight roads in Europe, but I mean, also you can find analogs in South America, these Mayan roads called Sekbeab. They're always these straight lines, and the work of Paul Devereaux suggests that they indicate the path that the spirit would take, the spirit would take from the church to the home, or the church to the graveyard, right? And that has a lot of correspondences to things like ley lines, because a lot of these straight lines do sort of connect these ancient monuments, which are sites where there's association with death, which are now known as paranormal hotspots. So you can see how it just sort of like, I mean, I'll be honest with you, it kind of got out of hand, but I think it was a good decision to sort of talk about all that stuff, so that once you got to the UFO stuff, and I started talking about things like the wandering soul and polypsychism and spirit roads, I didn't have to, like, spend another 3 paragraphs talking about something else. So that was the decision, and it ended up being comprehensive. And I'm not saying that I have a monopoly on the truth. I'm not saying that any of this is objectively true, but what really I walked away with was that this model worked for me, and it explained a lot of things that I just had no other way of explaining with the extraterrestrial hypothesis, with the interdimensional hypothesis. It made a lot of things make a lot more sense, at the very least on a symbolic level. So that's what I found really appealing about it.
Cool. Tell me about the wandering soul. You brought that up.
Yeah, so the wandering soul is this idea that at certain points our soul is separable. This might be your singular soul, if you believe in your singular soul. It might be one of your many souls, if you adhere to a polypsychic model. But it was this idea that at certain times your soul was loosely tethered to your body. And these might be things like sleep, trance, during trauma, during illness. These were all times when your soul might go off and sort of do its own thing, right? There are a lot of beliefs you'll find in a lot of different cultures. James Fraser talks about this in The Golden Bough, about not waking people up or not startling people when they're in a trance or something, because the idea is that bond between body and soul is so weak that their soul may never come back. It seems like a lot of the witches' sabbats were actually perhaps happening in astral form. People weren't literally going off and writing on witches' sabbats. There are a lot of allusions in the medieval literature of people remaining at home, their bodies, while they were also seen at a witch's sabbat. So it seems to be describing that sort of wandering soul idea. But one of the most important things with the wandering soul is this idea of the doppelganger, which we're all very familiar with.
Right.
And the doppelganger does seem to be part of this wandering soul idea. And the doppelganger, which is a double of yourself that you see or someone else sees, really bad if you see it, was often regarded as a death omen. And what I sort of discovered over the course of my work is that it's not a death omen in the sense that it causes death, but more that it's a symptom of death. It means that your body, the bond between your body and soul is weak enough that your soul can go out wandering. And it means that you're probably not doing so good. So there was this idea that if your soul were to wander, you might be close to death. And believe it or not, I found a way to make that. I found a way to tie that into the UFO lore as well. I mean, people see clones of themselves sometimes aboard craft, and the question is, well, is that a clone or is that a doppelganger? Because those are in a lot of ways very different things. And even the UFOs themselves is an idea that Carl Jung played with in his essay on flying saucers. he sort of played with the idea of the UFO as an exteriorized soul. And now today in 2020 in America, we're like, what the heck does that mean? But if you look at this wandering soul idea, then you're like, oh, I can see that. Like the soul is often conceptualized as an orb of light or a ball of light. Like you hear this all the time in the parapsychological literature. And what are a lot of these UFOs? A lot of times they're balls of light. So this idea that like it might actually be, I don't know, the witness's soul, someone else's soul out wandering, is an idea that I think is worth playing with. It's a promise that makes a lot more sense when you read the whole thing.
No, I get it, because Time Life many years ago had a series on supernatural stuff, and they actually and they had the one book on Irish lore and stuff about the doppelganger looking, when you're looking in a mirror, if you see yourself standing over your shoulder, it was supposed to be imminent death.
Yeah, and man, I love that the old Time Life stuff, the old the Reader's Digest stuff. Yeah, those are so good. The modern ones that they put out, not as good, but a lot of those old ones are just fantastic. And yeah, so it might mean death. And what you sort of start to see across the literature is that obviously a doppelganger isn't a definite signifier that you're going to die, because a lot of saints bilocated all the time, to no ill effect. A lot of people see their doppelgangers, or people say, hey, I could have sworn I saw you the grocery store, and nothing happens, right? So there does seem to be this idea that your soul can sort of wander around. There's a great Native American tale. I'm sorry, I can't recall off the top of my head which tribe it is. I like to be as specific as I can when I talk about these things, but there's one tale of a woman who was walking behind her husband, and they came to a fork in the path, and she watched as her husband split into two. And she ended up following what she believed was her husband's physical form. And then as the trail met back up, two forms merged once more, and she realized that if she'd followed his other form, she might have never come back. So you do see these stories about people sort of having the separation of the soul and it being just fine. And of course, that idea of the soul separating really does tie into things like, what are dreams? Where do we go when we dream? What is sleep paralysis? Like, these are all questions that end up getting asked. And, again, it's another reason the whole project got away from me, is because every insight sort of offered new questions. Like, well, I can't not talk about that now because it has bearing on something else. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I mean it's true. Like even when you investigate the paranormal, that a lot of people when they have paranormal experiences, it's always that time before they fall asleep, just before they fall asleep. They're right at that point where it's almost a meditation state. Where this happens.
Yeah, and I've come to suspect that that the whole sleep paralysis thing might not be the equivalent of your car breaking down in a bad neighborhood. Like you're returning back to your body and it stalls at the last minute, and you're like, oh, this is where all the low level stuff is. I found an interesting study. It's in the book. Can't remember the guy's name, but they discovered that when electrical amplification, electrical stimuli was applied to the brain, they could actually induce some of these states. And they found out that the higher the amplitude, the more likely you were to have a full-fledged out-of-body experience. And the lower the amplitude, the more likely you were to have something that looked a lot more like sleep paralysis. And I was like, that's really funny, because when you think about the entities that people meet during out-of-body experiences, they're often these light and airy and happy, entities, and the entities that people meet in sleep paralysis are these negative entities. And what do a lot of people call these things? They call them high vibration and low vibration. I'm like, high vibration, high amplitude, low vibration, low amplitude. Is there something really to that idea? It's fascinating.
So talking about aliens and their connection with all this, and as far as abductions go, why do you think there's alien abductions then, if this is all going on?
Well, so I think that if Ecology of Souls does anything well, because it retreads a lot of ground that people will find familiar, I think it's to say, hey, let's let all these things play together really nicely. And what I mean by that is, in the 1980s, Eddie Bullard released UFO Abductions Measure of a Mystery, and he, to me, proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that a lot of these modern alien abduction experiences look a lot like shamanic initiations across various cultures. Shamanism being a broad term for medicine men, medicine women, cunning women. It's just a broad term that we're going to use here. And then, of course, in the 90s, Kenneth Ring comes along and releases the Omega Project, which says, hey, these alien abductions look a lot like near-death experiences. And so you have these two different things. And you say, well, a lot of these initiations with, magical practitioners and indigenous cultures are near-death experiences. Like sometimes they literally are ordeals where they're buried alive and brought back, or they're given substances, or they're pushed to the brinks of of what they can withstand. They're either basically hurt or something. There's always some sort of near death component with a lot of these initiations. Not all the time, but oftentimes. So it does seem like we're talking about three things there, and I think that the alien abduction scenario might be sort of a reinvention of that. It's the same space, in other words, right? So I'm not sure if it's always sort of basically a shamanic initiation. I'm not sure if it's always sort of a near-death experience. It might be soul maintenance. I mean, Lori Barnes, who was a colleague of Whitley Strieber's, said that she believed that some of them were soul techs. And they would just sort of like check on your. It's like you got your 3,000-mile checkup on your soul, and they've just got to check in on you. And the implication, therefore, is that a lot of us have these experiences and we just don't consciously recall them. But so that might be a little bit of what's going on. I mean, in a lot of these indigenous cultures, there was the concept of soul theft. And that was one of the shaman's duties, was that, if you experienced your soul being abducted by some sort of malevolent entity, it was their job to astrally go and collect your soul and bring it back to Earth. And so I kind of wonder if some of these alien abduction experiences aren't that sort of soul theft idea coming back. Who's to say?
And in a way, that kind of explains, some of those reports of people that go that have illnesses, and then when they come back, there's no more illnesses.
Yeah, and of course, that was something that soul theft was practically synonymous with physical illness. That was the way that a lot of these cultures thought of it. They didn't think, you contacted a virus and you've got, or you got sick, except like that. They'd say, oh no, something has come and taken your soul, and it's sort of manifesting these symptoms. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's the other thing, is that like the number of alien abduction stories that contain some sort of spiritual message. I mean, these are not characters out of an Arthur C. Clarke novel. These are not atheistic emissaries from another planet. They seem to be intensely interested with how we are spiritually. Now, some people, I'm a Christian myself, but some people take that to its extreme and say, oh, it means that they're demons because they're doing all these things, and they're really interested in our souls. And I'm like, well, maybe there are angels and there are demons, but maybe there's a lot of stuff in between that has sort of a flexible affiliation, if you will. I mean, that's certainly what the fairy lore would seem to suggest. There were bad fairies and there were good fairies, but a lot of those in between were just sort of like, they could be good or bad.
Well, then that brings you to like not only fairy lore, but you look at religions and demonology and all this stuff, and maybe that's what they're talking about. I mean, that's like anybody else. There's good aliens and there's bad aliens, and when people were in contact with these things or whatever they are, that's how they put them.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize this enough. I think that's a great point, and to sort of build off that, like, I'm not sure that angel, demon, alien, fairy, ascended master, higher self, I'm not sure that any of these terms are actually an accurate, objective read of what these things are. I just think that they exist in some form or fashion.
Absolutely. So, as you were doing the research, how willing were people to talk to you, or what kind of research did you draw from?
Well, I have a pretty good library that I was able to sort of take a look at. I also have a lot of periodicals that are searchable, so that helps a lot too. I did work with some witnesses directly. It's kind of funny. When I started out, trying to get people to share their experiences with me was a little bit more difficult because it's like, who are you? What are you going to do with my name? That sort of thing. But it's gotten a little bit easier to say, hey, with every book, it gets a little bit easier to say, hey, look, I've got this other stuff out there. I got a lot of other anonymous people in these books. You can be anonymous too if you want to share it. Do I have your permission? So yeah, I had a great witness who stepped forward, and she actually allowed me to use her full name. But she and her boyfriend at the time were on Mackinac Island at a Halloween party, and they both saw a UFO. But the curious thing is, it was a very unconventional UFO. Her boyfriend saw basically like this amoeba jellyfish like pink thing going through the sky. Or I think she saw that. That's right, if memory serves. She saw that, and her partner saw basically the equivalent of a giant Native American thunderbird. And they both said, "Look at that." And then afterwards they're like, "What did you see?" And they had completely different answers. And the bird thing, it's really interesting, I've got to say. There are some stories of people who say that UFOs turn into birds. That's a perfect example of something that I didn't know what to do with before I started Ecology of Souls. But once you look at like all these older traditions, birds and souls have been synonymous for a long time, a very long time, and truly universal. I mean, I don't use that term lightly either. I mean, it's every continent has multiple cultures that think of the bird as a soul. That's the way that they envision it. So that does tie back into this idea of the UFO as an exteriorized soul, if it can somehow take the shape of a bird, and of course brings back in the owls that are seen around UFOs. And it's a big mess. It's a big cobweb mess. It's like a spider's web.
Stories. I mean, I had a gentleman on here a few months ago that talked about that, how the UFOs are somehow they're programming these UFOs like the ones you see in Mount Shasta, like supposed ones in Mount Shasta, for instance, and how they're set to look like different shapes so that they don't alarm people, and people can't tell they're there.
And so the question becomes: is that technology, or is that them somehow interacting with us,
with our brains?
Yeah, with our brains, or what? And you mentioned that's another fascinating thing is, a lot of UFOs are purported to have bases in mountains and volcanoes. We hear this all the time all around the world.
Right.
Well, mountains were places where fairies lived, mountains and hills and such. But the reason why is because mountains resembled burial mounds, and mountains were often thought in a lot of medieval thinking, mountains were believed to be where the dead would go. There are even some Russian euphemisms for dying where they'd say they didn't die, they went to the mountain. Like that's what they'd say. And it's just like, man, is that coincidence, or is there something else going on?
Well, I was just thinking too, when you talk about her seeing one thing, him seeing the other. When I was in journalism school, they do that thing where they want you to be observant, so they'll run somebody through the room. It's like the police do, and the idea is to write down what you see. Well, the thing is, not everybody sees the same thing,
right?
So that's interesting too.
There's this interesting book that my friend Soraya Azkath brings up a lot called The Invisible Gorilla, and it's all about perception. And the basis for it was a YouTube video that I think is still out there. Well, where you can show someone the video and you can say, "Keep your eye on the basketball," and they'll keep their eye on the basketball. And at the end, you say, "Did you see the gorilla?" I'm like, "What?" And what it is in the middle of the video, someone walks through the people playing basketball, clearly walks right through them in a gorilla costume. And most people don't see the guy in the gorilla costume because they're so focused on watching the ball. So that suggests a lot about the way that our brains process information, and perhaps how that could be manipulated or exploited.
Right. Yeah. That they're doing that. So what's next for you?
Oh boy, I've got way too many irons in the fire. We're just wrapping up work on the Ufology Tarot. I did a couple of entries for it, and there's also an accompanying coffee table book that's coming out. That's part of a Kickstarter campaign. So I don't know if any of that's going to be available for purchase, but we're sort of putting the finishing touches on that. So that's been occupying a lot of my brain space. I'm partnering with Barbara Fisher on a book. I've got something else coming out with Jeremy Renner. Now you know it. Timothy Renner again. We have a couple of projects lined up, and I should be partnering with Allison Jornlin coming up soon as well. I don't know how I'm going to I don't know how I'm going to juggle all those things, because I've also gotten a wild idea to try and write a novel. So I've got way too many things on my plate right now. So there's all that going on. But in addition to that, I'm actively pursuing a lot more field work, because it's been a long time since my supernatural cup has been filled, so to speak. And I don't know if you found this. It'd be interesting to hear it. But like, do you find that the longer you go without experiencing something, the more you start to have these intrusive thoughts of like, maybe this isn't? Because I've had some stuff happen to me that was very objectively real that happened. Like I know what happened to me, right?
Right.
But the further I get away from it, it's like, well, did that really happen the way I thought it did? And I have to
Right,
remind
right,
I
right,
have to remind myself the way that I felt the next morning.
right. Yeah, I got to do the same thing because COVID hit, we stopped going out, and
Yeah,
then I got busy with this 3 years ago, and I haven't really been out. So I mean,
yeah,
I got to get back out.
yeah. I mean, I think it is important. I think that there's. Let's put it this way. I think the people that say that we don't need sort of paranormal scholars
Hmm.
are wrong. And I think the people who say that we don't need paranormal field researchers are also wrong. Like, I think you need a healthy balance of that. And I've
Sure.
definitely been favoring the former more than the latter. So I've been doing a little bit more field work. Still haven't had anything happen yet, but I have some stuff in my past that I can remember, and hopefully there's some stuff in the future as well.
There you go. How can people find you, sir?
My website is joshuacutchin.com, JOSHUACUTCHIN.com. A list of all my appearances on podcasts and such can be found there. Also, if you would like to pick up copies of Ecology of Souls, you can write me, and you can purchase them directly from me at a discount if you buy 2 or 3 copies. I say 2 or 3 copies because it's a little bit confusing. It's available on Amazon as one ebook of combined volumes 1 and 2, or as print volume 1, print volume 2, and the optional print companion. As I mentioned earlier, the companion with all the references and notes is freely available on my website. So, but if you want to get all that from me, Amazon doesn't allow you to like bundle purchases together for some reason. It kind of seems like a missed opportunity. But like if you buy them from me, you get a discount if you buy the whole set, either 2 or all 3. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We'll have to get you back on another time
Sounds
and talk
great.
to you. You're so
Absolute
busy.
pleasure.
It's so fun
Yeah,
to have you.
I'm a little bit busy, but yeah, this has been great. Thank you so much.
All right, Joshua. Thank you
All right,
so much.
take care.
You have a good rest of your evening.
You too.
Okay. Bye bye. All right. It's always fascinating to talk to him, and he's always so busy. Always, always, always. Tomorrow night, I have a surprise guest coming on. Now, is it going to be a surprise guest, or am I going to be reading from the Salem Witch book? We don't know yet, so you're going to have to tune in to find out. But it should be an interesting night either way tomorrow night. So that'll be at 6:30 p.m. Pacific, and I'm looking forward to having you guys here. The chat room tonight. Thank you so much, Marisa, for being here, and John. I think it's John. I can't see. See, I told you my glasses are horrible. There we go. Yeah, John. Thank you for coming in the chat room. I really appreciate it. I appreciate it tremendously. Um, Again, I will see you tomorrow night and 6:30 p.m. Pacific with the surprise guest. Or, like I said, will I be reading or will it be a surprise guest? I just feel like doing something like that tomorrow to tease you guys into coming in to watch the show. So I will see you and have a good evening. And oh yes, I forgot. See, I'm missing my plugs. I'm missing everything here. Whoa. If you like the show, share it with 5 people. If you hated the show, share it with 5 of your enemies. We're equal opportunity here at California Haunts Radio, so we're just trying to get the word out on the show. And again, if you were watching from Facebook and you liked what you saw, please be sure to hit the like button and to hit the follow button. I'm looking for followers, whether you're on my page or you're on California Haunts Ghostly Event page. Please be sure to follow. If you're watching from YouTube again, click on that little ghost in the bottom right-hand corner if you haven't done so already to subscribe, and that'll subscribe you. All right? Okay, well, I will see you tomorrow, 6:30 p.m. Pacific. Have a good night.